Westminster election, and reform has seen success in some English votes. Many people in Hamilton are fed up with all parties.
Now completely disillusioned with a lot of them. They're just in it for themselves. Promise you the world, but you get nothing.
Very indecisive. It's my birthday that day, so I will be voting because I would always vote, but I really don't know who to vote for.
I'm scunnered with the way Hamilton is, and I just want somebody to do something.
They keep saying they'll do this, they'll bring this to the area, they'll clear this up, they'll clear that up, but they never do nothing.
5 miles away from Hamilton is Larkhall, a former industrial town. Colin owns an electrical shop and has worked here for 40 years.
Big issue is immigration, the taxes that are people paying, taxes that small businesses are paying, because we're paying a lot of tax trying to employ people, but we can't employ somebody else because of the taxes we're paying. State of the place, the roads, the pavements.
And what would you say to the politicians?
Get your finger out and come on, let's go. Get on with it.
Round the corner, in a cafe, we meet George.
The Tories, SNP, Labour, and every one of them's had a chance to do something and they've failed. Reform
doesn't have a record to defend in Scotland. The party's thrown a lot at this by-election and says it's targeting at least second. The SNP and Labour both say they're aiming to win. Back in Hamilton, Jennifer's renovating her tattoo and piercing business. She's got many things on her mind.
Taxes, VAT, import fees, women's safety in the workplace, yeah, that sort of thing.
And how do you think the politicians are doing generally?
I think there's a lot of things missing. There's nothing really cohesive for me happening. It seems like it's all a bit like a lip service.
This is one by-election in one seat, but it could give the winner momentum ahead of next year's Scottish Parliament elections.
Well, that was Katie Hunter out there in Hamilton, where the word scunnered came up. We knew it would, didn't we? Because that's what we've been hearing right the way through. Helen McDade from Reform, just let me continue that conversation over there a little bit. And on the basis of what we're hearing here, are people voting for something or against something?
Well,
why
yes,
are people
we do
voting
have
for
policies,
reform?
and indeed it wasn't covered
not
widely.
A complete platform.
Well, Nigel made a very good speech up in Aberdeen on Monday about net zero. That is a policy of ours to abolish net zero, to help people's energy bills. You know, Lucy was talking about people not being able to, find where they're going to get the money to heat their house and feed their kids. Well, we have amongst the highest electricity costs in the world, and that is ridiculous. And we're closed down our oil and gas. We're closing down our oil and gas, and to get rid of our homegrown energy so that we can import it. It's not that we're all stopping driving cars, and if everyone says, oh, I've got an electric car, most of that electricity might be made by gas at the moment. We import about 20% of our electricity a lot of the time from France, from nuclear. So our energy policy is a mess. And all our industry, they had to save the steel, but they didn't save Port Talbot. 3,000 jobs or something went there. So people know what's going on. We don't have an economy. It's not just flatlining. If you ask people what's the top three, economy things in Scotland, people can't come up with anything. Tourism, and then they kind of dry up.
What is the solution to the cost of living crisis that we're in that case?
Well, one of them is to reduce the energy costs, a lot of which are being put there by net zero, and also so that we don't cut down our own homegrown food. I mean, what we're doing to farmers is ridiculous. That comes down to the Labour Party down south, inheritance tax, but also the SNP are all for them planting trees on fertile farmland. It's a nonsense.
Paul O'Kane, fuel brings me to GB Energy. Your party stood in the last election on two main platforms. We're going to boost the economy and we're going to create an enormous revolution with GB Energy. If I'd invested in you with my vote, I'd be looking for a return on that by now. Where is it?
Well, we always said that the infrastructure of a publicly owned energy company was the start, and then that was about the investment that will then flow through. I'm glad to say that Michael Shanks, who was referenced earlier, by-election winner, of course, took the bill through Parliament, and we now have a publicly owned energy company that will start to support the sort of growth we need to see in the green economy, and that's about projects across the country. And here in Scotland, we have great capacity and great potential, particularly in things like wind power, and we need to see that investment, and that's what's going to come through now through that company that we've set up.
We're a year in to your government, and there's barely any evidence of it. We don't hear about it anymore. It was the only thing Anna Sarwar was talking about this time last year.
Well, I don't think it's fair to say we've seen nothing. As I said, that bill went through the House of Commons. It's now an act. We now have the publicly owned company. We've been doing a lot of work in terms of that setup so that we can invest for the future. And, you know, the reality is this is a long-term investment in terms of turning the economy around, and that's what it's there to do, and that's what it will do.
Who's going to get the winter fuel allowance?
Well, look, you know, I think winter fuel allowance is an interesting point. In Scottish Labour, we've always said that we think that more pensioners should have been eligible for the winter fuel allowance. Obviously, it's devolved.
So you've U-turned on it,
No,
right?
just hold on, Martin. I'm just going to make this point that it's a devolved payment to the Scottish Parliament. So when we had the opportunity to amend the Social Security Amendment Bill that went through the Parliament, I actually brought amendments to say we should widen the scope of the winter fuel payment here in Scotland, but actually we shouldn't give it to millionaires. We should claw that back. Angus and his party voted against that.
Let me just talk to these pictures we're watching for a second, because Angus's party colleague, Katie Loudon, is just arriving at the Cown, looking very chipper, hugging and kissing as she arrives. Maybe that's just her demeanour. Maybe she knows something we don't yet. Who knows? We'll all find out maybe in about half an hour from now. Anyway, that is Katie Loudon, the SNP candidate, arriving in Hamilton. Sorry, Paul. Yes. No, listen, let me get you back on track. 'Cause you were talking about Scottish Labour's policy. UK Labour made a U-turn on the winter fuel allowance earlier this week. I'm just asking you, which pensioners are going to get it?
So the Chancellor the other day and has said for a number of weeks now that we need to broaden the scope, because actually what we're seeing is the economy beginning to turn a corner, which I think is very important, which means we can reinvest in terms of those winter fuel payments. So what we want to see is more pensioners be eligible this winter. What I don't want to see, though, Martin, hold on. What I don't want to see is I don't want to see millionaires, you know, who don't necessarily need the winter fuel allowance.
So where's the bar?
Well, look, that's going to be determined, obviously, in terms of the spending review next week and the work that the Chancellor and the Treasury are doing. But I think it's crucial, and I think most fair-minded people would agree that we want to see more pensioners get access to winter fuel payment, but not necessarily Rod Stewart, Annie Lennox and the Duke of Buccleuch.
But I'm sure Rod Stewart won't be crying any tears, but here's the problem. Some people will, because what's happened is you've taken it away from everybody, and then you've effectively U-turned and you've allowed the narrative to become, we're giving it back. And now you're going to have to tell a lot of people you're taking it back off them again. Why are you so bad at politics?
Well, with respect, Martin, I haven't U-turned because my position in Scotland has been consistent.
No, but your party has.
It's a devolved payment.
It?
And may I point out, before Angus jumps in, because you might, the SNP voted against the proposals I brought forward to the Chamber of the Scottish Parliament because this is a devolved payment. So I haven't U-turned, Martin.
Angus?
I've been consistent.
Well, this is just fantasy stuff.
Well, it's not.
Last year, people were encouraged to vote for change and an end to Tory austerity. And amongst the first things that happened were the Labour Party cutting winter fuel payments, doing nothing for WASPy women, are now about to attack the poor and disabled in benefit cuts. These are exactly the kind of things that scunner people. And I'm not surprised that folk out there are thinking things have not changed, they have not got better, they should get better. We've heard about energy prices being a major factor. Of course they are. How can we be one of the biggest energy-producing countries in Europe and have the energy bills that we have? But to have the party of Brexit at the end of the panel here not able to understand that the biggest single factor contributing to the cost of living crisis that we have in this country and the impact on our economy is the hard Brexit that Nigel Farage managed to secure. We are paying for all of this now. And no wonder people out there are asking themselves, how on earth can we turn things around? And I think what is going to be clear from this by-election is that a lot of people are wanting to see change, undoubtedly, but unfortunately they haven't had it from the Labour Party, and they're certainly not going to get it from the party of Brexit.
This is extraordinary. So we've got Angus, who spent the entire campaign talking up reform. So John Swinney and Angus and his party have spent the entire campaign talking up reform because it's in their interest.
And actually, you knew what you were doing.
We talk about change. We've had 18 years now of an SNP government, and we've still got 1 in 6 Scots on a waiting list. We know the huge housing emergency we have in this country. We know that standards in our education system are slipping, and there's violence in our schools. If the SNP had a good idea to deal with that over 18 years, we would have heard it by now. So It's a bit rich for Angus, I think.
And if all of these things were as simple as that, the Labour Party that has been in power for the last 100 years, 100 years in Wales would not have worse statistics on all of these things.
Right. I'm sorry to spoil the party. Craig Hoy, you want to come in?
Well, it's just interesting to be sitting here between two failing governments on my left and my right who are now arguing about who punished pensioners the least. I mean, who would have thought that a Labour government would come in and have done that? And then the SNP are only partially restoring it. I mean, you've only been in government. You've only been in government for 12 months.
About Liz Truss's economic
12 months.
The Shadow Chancellor has now accepted that there should be some contrition for Liz Truss and the decisions she made. You want to have some contrition, Craig, about that?
Well, absolutely. I was frequently on Martin's programme where I was perfectly level. And
but there is an irony in the fact that you're criticising both the people beside you for their failing governments when the only time your party has really been mentioned tonight is bemoaning the legacy that you've left as you exited government. Is that
well,
not
actually,
fair?
no, because if you think about the economic legacy, inflation was coming down, we had the best growth in the G7, and we were actually starting to restore the fundamentals of the economy.
Craig.
But we were actually starting to build the fundamentals of the economy.
Has been accused by your own party colleague of enacting economic vandalism.
But under Rishi Sunak, we stabilised that. We saw that inflation was falling down. Mortgage rates were starting to fall. Look at the effects of Rachel Reeves' budget on the economy, but still lagging behind where they would. But also a tax on jobs, a national insurance and tax on jobs, which you said you wouldn't put in place, and that is causing real damage to, for example, the Scottish hospitality industry. You're going to have to recognise, Paul, that your government has broken its commitments to the Scottish people.
But the Scottish hospitality industry was not in fine fettle 11 months ago when you left power, was it? How can you absolve any of the blame from your own party when you were in government for 15 years?
Well, if you look at what we've now been arguing for in Scotland for the Scottish hospitality and leisure industries, we advocated this year for 100%.
These problems were largely caused by you.
We advocated for 100% rates relief for those. For some reason, the SNP have decided to squirrel away the money that have been given by the UK government for rates relief for struggling hospitality businesses. The question is, Angus, why are those industries not a priority for the SNP? They are fundamental to Brand Scotland. They are hugely important to the Scottish economy. And you're letting pubs go to the wall twice the speed of the rest of the UK because of the fact that you've reprioritised money that was meant for Scottish hospitality to other pet projects.
So you're nodding at him. Answer him.
So Craig's brought his magic money tree. Every time this issue has been debated in the Scottish Parliament and has been raised by his colleague Murdo Fraser, I've asked him to tell me where he's going to get the money from. He's still to tell me.
I'll tell you who is being respectful here is Helmut Dave, who's sitting patiently waiting to come in, and I'm going to bring her in. I'm going to rewind what seems like an eternity to the point that Angus made earlier on about Brexit being actually right at the heart of all of this.
Because, first of all, I'd like to rewind to Leslie, and I hate to tell you this, Leslie, but over 1 million Scots voted for Brexit, more than voted for the SNP, more than voted for Labour last year. So Brexit, actually, every time you go on about Brexit, over 1 million Scots voted for it. And, we've listened to you all saying, the Scots had nothing to do with it. 3 months after Brexit, which was not a hard Brexit, it was a Boris, Northern Ireland fix. But 3 months...
Is it for the problems we're facing?
No, 3 months after that, COVID, lockdown, the first lockdown, fair enough kind of thing. Nicola had to lock us down earlier, faster, if Christmas was coming, if the school holidays were coming. And, people have forgotten this or they didn't know this. But businesses did not get handouts the way people sitting at home
Are you seeing Brexit benefits?
Well, we're not seeing the benefits we should because we've just given our fishing rights away again, a scandalous thing to do. I mean,
So when did we vote for Brexit?
What?
When did we vote for Brexit? Where are the benefits?
Yeah, but the fishing rights were given away at that time to get a deal, and they were going to get it back, and our dear friends in the Labour government have just handed it away for I can't remember how many decades. It's a scandal.
Right, but you're not pointing to any benefit. There haven't been any discernible benefits.
We've had COVID.
I'm just asking you if there are any benefits from Brexit.
Well, yes, there was. Trump gave us a better deal than they gave the EU.
Right, we'll see what happens to that. Trump's got quite a lot on his plate today. But listen, let's go back to the count just now. Lindsay brought us a senior Labour figure in the shape of Jackie Bailey just a few minutes ago. She is now standing by, I think, with a senior figure from the SNP. Lindsay.
Hi, Martin. Yes, that's right. You will be pleased to know, I think we're only about 20 minutes or so away from getting the result here of this by-election. There's the adjudication of the doubtful ballots taking place, and just as you were coming to me there, we saw the arrival of the Scottish Labour candidate Davy Russell. But I am indeed joined by Mary McCallan from the SNP. She is the Cabinet Secretary for Energy and Net Zero. Thank you so much, Mary McCallan, for joining us. Can the SNP win tonight? Are you going to win tonight?
We can win tonight. I think there's no doubt this is close. I've been on the doors in the campaign for the last number of weeks. This is the constituency which neighbours mine, and my experience on the doors is that it's been close. But yes, we can win, and I hope people will have come behind the SNP because we have stood for a better Scotland, standing against what Farage has brought to this campaign, but also being very squarely focused on the priorities of the people of Scotland, the cost of living, the NHS. I hope people will back that.
You mentioned being on the doors there and the campaign being close, but we were hearing from John Swinney that he felt this was a two-horse race between the SNP and Reform UK. He discounted Scottish Labour as a factor in this by-election just last week, but they could win tonight, couldn't they? It's very close between you and that party.
I don't think we ever discounted anybody. I think it's always felt close.
Well, John Swinney said it was a two-horse race between the SNP and Reform UK and that Scottish Labour had given up.
I think we always felt it was on a knife edge, and I think that what was very clear to us on the ground was that Labour had not run a particularly good campaign. They had a candidate who wouldn't show up to hustings, who wouldn't take part in debates, who wasn't seen on the doors. And we felt the presence of reform, but what we were squarely focused on with our fantastic candidate Katie Loudon was the priorities of the people of Scotland, and that's what we've focused on, and I do hope people will back that.
What have you made of Reform UK as a factor in this by-election and the way this campaign has played out?
Well, my experience is that it's been very positive. I mean, we have spent all the time we have trying to speak to as many voters as we can, and people were receptive to that. Like, there's no doubt that Reform, their presence in Scotland, their presence in this election has been felt, and it must be resisted. And what I can say, Lindsay, is that we will not do what Keir Starmer and the Labour Party have done, which is try to imitate Reform to beat Reform. We will take on Reform squarely on the issues where they have let people down. On Brexit, for example, which has made us on average £2,000 poorer. Their comments on the NHS about moving to an insurance-style system. We'll fight them on those issues.
Well, both yourselves, the SNP and Scottish Labour, have criticised Reform quite heavily during this by-election campaign, but from what we're seeing, we're getting indications that they're going to come at least third in this by-election. So people out there are voting for them. They must be doing something right. They have an appeal to voters in not just this constituency, but if national polling is to be believed, across Scotland as well.
Well, look, we will wait and see how the numbers fall. But I think we have to respond to what people are telling us, and I have no doubt life is very difficult just now. It's been difficult for over a decade. It's been difficult for 15 years with austerity, Brexit, a cost of living crisis, the pandemic. But what the SNP has done in that time is supported the pockets of the people of Scotland, and we've protected them from the worst excesses of all of these events. So we'll keep doing that whilst Reform try to exploit difficulties. We'll find solutions.
If you don't win this by-election tonight, if the SNP doesn't win and Scottish Labour manage to take this seat, how damaging would that be for your party going into next year's Holyrood election? How important is this by-election going into that national election next year?
Well, of course, it's important. It sets a scene. We are just under a year out from a Holyrood election. But regardless of what happens, the SNP is in a really strong position. I think anyone who's observed us in this campaign will see an energised party, a united party, a party that's ready to win. So I hope we will win tonight. But even if we don't, we will regroup and we will be prepared to win in 26.
Probably not very long until we find out. Mary McCallan, thank you very much. Martin, back to you in the studio.
Lindsay, we will see you very soon, I'm sure. Thanks very much indeed for that. Lindsay Bewes there with Mary McCallan in Hamilton. I'm going to return now to my panel. Leslie, I'm going to use a word now that's barely been used at all in this campaign, to the surprise of a lot of people: independence. We've heard very little about it, and we hear now that when John Swinney meets Sir Keir Starmer, it's not mentioned. Are you surprised by any of this?
Yes. Yes, Because, I mean, what it looks like people are trying to say is we actually need to cut through, get some radical solutions to things that just seem stuck and just repeat themselves. For flatlining as an economy, as a country, we seem to be quite archaic in many respects. What's going to change that? The Reform vote is hoping it's a different set of people. The people who support independence, like myself, are thinking it actually needs to be a different constitutional settlement, and that the Scots, despite what Helen said, sure, 1 million people did vote for Brexit, 62% of Scots voted to remain in the EU, which was a cliff edge at the border. Every single council area in Scotland voted to remain. That's quite a different pattern with the same inputs, if you like, same arguments and broadcasting and whatever. We came out with a very different response. We've been voting differently for 100 years. So to me, there's a different country in there that needs to find a way to express itself. Now, I wish that there had been more talk about independence because I think people would respond. And the opinion polls suggest we're sitting on 54% for independence at the moment. I know people will come in and say, oh, but do people want it tomorrow? How would it be delivered? All those things. That's different than where it was sitting even a year ago.
But it's curious, though, isn't it? There's this decoupling. I mean, when the independence support, the polls suggest independent support is kind of flatlining or going up a bit. It's certainly not dropping significantly. And yet when the SNP major on it, when they go hard on it, their support seems to drop. John Swinney seems to have arrived at this notion that it's probably best shutting up about it and getting on with governing the country, because that seems to be what works at the moment.
Well, there's a difficulty for the SNP, I'll give you that they're a Scottish government and they're a party of independence. So they have to have a day job, which people will rate or not rate. And then they're also advocating for a completely different kind of setup for the UK. So those two things are quite hard to do in one party with one leader who's a First Minister and leader of that movement. And many people, I would agree with them, think that there has to be more of a civic movement for independence because it resolves some of those difficulties. But I mean, if we come back to the energy questions, the net zero that Helen was talking about, the reason that there are expensive bills is because every unit of energy is priced at the most expensive, which is gas. That's something that a UK government could change and doesn't. Energy is a reserve power. Scotland is awash with renewable energy and it's already producing more than 100% of what we need. So we would be an energy superpower if we were able to change the terms of trade, and you can't do that within the UK.
Right, I listen to your podcast frequently. I know that you spend a lot of your time assessing how we best provide energy to people, and you look at other countries and see what systems we could cherry pick and employ here. What do you think about this renewable boom that we've been promised and how it is arriving? Because there's a lot of concern out there that it is not coming in at the scale we were told to expect. I keep hearing from people in the North East, actually, you've got to come up here and do stories up here because the jobs crisis is really starting to bite.
Yeah, there's a whole load of issues of how this is not working. In every other country, the loading of extra, if you like, the kind of green taxes is put onto the taxpayer, not the bill payer. Now, that might sound semantic, but it's more progressive to pay for change through taxation because it means the millionaires that we've heard of earlier pay a bigger whack. What we're doing here is making bill payers pay for the full 9 yards. Nobody else does it like that. We've got privatised companies who are in charge of making decisions about where grid connection goes. We've got renewable energy from Scotland being horsed off south. You know, there's an awful lot of the infrastructure here that is not benefiting local people at all. They're getting paid pennies when they've got essentially steel around them that doesn't benefit the community. But that's because this is a top-down society that never gives more than a bobby to the local punter.
Lucy Dunn, she makes it sound so easy.
Well, I think just going back to the independence point, I can actually understand why John Swinney right now is not talking about independence. I think if you look back to the points at which the SNP were very successful, or certainly successful in drumming up support, was when they did focus on delivery, day-to-day delivery, as opposed to the constitutional question. I think there's also the issue of there's no clear route to independence as yet right now. And I think that, you know, under the leadership of Humza Yousaf, the independence issue was talked about a lot. Post Nicola Sturgeon's resignation, there was a lot of talk about whether you go through a fundamentalist way way, whether you are approaching it from a more gradualistic point of view. I think actually people are a bit fed up of talking about constitutional stuff just now, and they just want to see the cost living crisis go away. They want to be able to go to their GPs and actually get seen. They want to be able to go to A&E and not be stuck in a trolley for 15 hours. I think this is the type of stuff that if you're in government, you need to be dealing with first and foremost before you can then start to look at those other types of priorities.
John, you either snorted or sighed 3 times now.
Well, I mean,
what do you want to say?
Let's go to the backstory here. So if we go look at the 2021 Scottish election, at that point, something like 85 to 90% of those people who at that time said that they would vote yes in an independence referendum were backing the SNP on the constituency ballot. And equally, about 90% of those people who say they would vote no to independence voted for one of the unionist parties. Our politics had almost become like the politics of Northern Ireland. Nothing else seemed to matter. Now, Lucy is right that since Nicola Sturgeon's resignation, and this is the crucial moment in this Parliament when things began to go wrong for the SNP, since Nicola Sturgeon's resignation, the voters have indeed, who are still committed to independence, some of them have become more reluctant to vote for the SNP, almost undoubtedly because of their record. I can certainly show you data that indicates that, for example, that people who voted for the SNP back in 2019, who felt the health service weren't doing very well. Before Nicola Sturgeon's resignation, it didn't seem to make any difference. After Nicola Sturgeon's resignation, you start to see how people who are unhappy about the health service in Scotland defecting from the SNP. But I think where I would disagree with Lucy is to come away with the idea, oh, look, the independence question doesn't matter. There are still very, very few people who would vote no in an independence referendum who are willing to vote for the SNP. And that is still fundamentally different from what happened in 2011 when the SNP got an overall majority. Unionists are still deeply concerned about the constitutional question, and it's very clearly reflected in their votes. The SNP's problem is that there is this substantial body of voters who say they still vote for independence but are reluctant to vote for the SNP. And so I think I think she is right that the SNP needs to focus on delivery. But they don't need just to focus on delivery. They need to focus on delivery in such a way that persuades the people who are most likely to come back to them, which are, frankly, the people who believe in independence.
OK, I mean, that cuts to almost to what Leslie was saying we were inevitably going to ask about, oh, yeah, maybe I want it, but maybe not yet. So the narrative of last year's general election was that a lot of people who broadly want independence, but maybe 5 years down the line don't want a referendum yet, who had voted SNP, lent their votes to Labour, maybe went back to Labour for a while to test that out, to get rid of the Tories. Let's bring this back to tonight. If Labour win tonight, does that suggest that a significant proportion of those votes have stuck with Labour?
I think it's certainly true that the SNP have not reclaimed a lot of the ground that they lost to Labour as of last year.
How much should that worry them looking to next year?
Well, I mean, the answer is it depends on what happens to the unionist vote at the moment. The reason why we're saying, well, it looks as though the SNP are favourites to win the next Holyrood election is because of the fragmentation of the unionist vote, which has been a consequence of reform. Frankly, I don't think the SNP want reform to rise any higher, because if reforms were to rise any higher in the polls, they would be starting to concentrate the reform vote, the unionist vote, rather than fragment it. But at the moment, we've got the SNP in the opinion polls at about 33%, not much better than they were last summer, still only getting just over half of the people who believe in independence voting for them. But because the Conservatives and Labour, both of them have been losing ground heavily to reform, according to the polls, therefore the SNP look as though they're sitting pretty. So you're right, the SNP have not been particularly successful in reclaiming those lost yes voters to Labour. And if they are going to get in a position where they might actually get an overall majority in Holyrood next year, they certainly need to do that, because they're a very long way from achieving that objective at the moment.
OK, Lucy, let me just come to you. We heard an accusation from Craig Hoy earlier on that will make Angus Robertson hoot and snort and chunter, I'm sure, and I'll come to him if he does that later on in the programme and let him answer it. The accusation was that John Swinney is talking up Nigel Farage and reform because it suits him. Because the better they do, the more the unionist vote is split. Do you think that is a credible accusation?
I think that reform doing well in Scotland is right now where reform are doing. beneficial to the SNP. It splits the unionist vote in a way that means that Scottish Labour are no longer looking like the main opponent, one of the main opponents certainly still, but they're not the only one. And actually Reform is an easier opponent in many ways for the SNP. There's clearer dividing lines between the two parties.
Can you see John Swinney just employing, just maliciously employing that, or nakedly employing that tactic?
I don't think
that's in his politics.
I don't think I'd use the word maliciously, but I can definitely understand why the SNP would want to look at Reform just now, because also what it does is both Reform and the SNP are saying they're in a two-horse race against the other. They're both discounting Labour, and as a result, I think if you look at the coverage, it looks as though, well, let's not even bother with Labour. There might be people that were Conservatives that wouldn't bother with the Conservatives because they are not really mentioned much, and as a result, they go, well, do I want to go with either the SNP or Reform? Now, I think, as John just said, the SNP won't want to see Reform doing that much better over the next couple of months to years, because then there's a real risk that they could be eating into the nationalist vote. And whilst that's not really happening just now, I would say when I was in Larkhall, for example, I did speak to a number of ex-SNP voters who said that, particularly for this by-election, even potentially in 2026, they might consider backing Reform this time.
Yeah, the time for talking is almost over. That hubbub that we heard suggests that there is a declaration imminent. Candidates are being called to verify the count, I'm told, so we are almost there. Lesley, what do you think? Is it too cynical to suggest that it suits John Swinney very nicely to have Reform sitting pretty, so he has turned up the volume on that narrative? He's pushed them right into the centre of this campaign?
Well, possibly, but if you look forward to what might be, the next set of elections, we've already got a statement from Nigel Farage that he is under no circumstances going to work with Labour in Scotland. So, there's already a difficulty for the unionist groupings to come together in a government if that's something they're going to stand by. And just in the interest of sort of debunking an awful lot of other stuff from recent local elections and so on, Plaid Cymru are doing pretty well in Wales. Sinn Féin are doing pretty well in Northern Ireland. There are nationalist parties doing pretty well in all the Celtic countries. And when there's an advance for one, there's an advance for all. So that Northern Ireland may have a very different lesson soon, and I know people can often overstate the possibility of reunification, but they have a mechanism for a border poll which Scotland lacks.
Right. The time for saying the time for talking is over. The candidates have been called to the stage. We're about to go to Hamilton. Yeah, I think that's all of them.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the declaration of the result for Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse constituency. As constituency returning officer for the Scottish Parliament by-election in Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse, I give notice that the total number of votes polled for each candidate was as follows. Colette Bradley, Scottish Socialist Party, 278. Andy Brady, Scottish Family Party, 219. Ross Lambie, Reform UK, 7,088. Katie Loudon, Scottish National Party, 7,957. Janice Mackay, UK Independence Party, 50. Anne McGuinness, Scottish Green Party, 695. Aisha Mia, Scottish Liberal Democrats, 533. Richard Nelson, Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party, 1,621. Davy Russell, Scottish Labour Party, 8,559. Mark Wilkinson, Independent, 109. There were 46 ballots rejected, and I declare that Davy Russell is elected to serve in the Scottish Parliament as the member for Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse. Thank you for your attention, and I'd now like to invite the successful candidate to say a few words.
Well, you are now looking at the new MSP for Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse, Davy Russell. He didn't speak much to us during the campaign, but he's about to speak to the hall. Let's hear what he has to say.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to start by thanking the returning officer, all his staff here and across the constituency, and the police for the way the election has been handled. You have again done South Lanarkshire proud. I would also like to thank the other candidates for playing their part in the democratic process. And I wouldn't be standing here now if it wasn't for the effort of the whole Labour campaign team. You were sensational. And I also must thank my family and friends for the support that they've given me throughout this campaign. I am so proud to be elected as member of the Scottish Parliament for my home and my community. I said in this campaign that I will put this community, our community, first. I will work every single day to do that. Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse has voted tonight to take a new direction with Scottish Labour. Like the people here in Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse, and right across Scotland, we all feel we've been let down by the SNP. They've broken our NHS, wasted our money, and after nearly 2 decades, they don't deserve another chance. This community has also sent a message to Farage and his mob tonight. The poison of reform isn't us, it isn't Scotland, and we don't want your division here. Reform have no real answers to the issues we face, and they can't beat the SNP here or replace them across Scotland. And for Ross, can you see me now? Anna Sarwar and Scottish Labour are ready to fix our NHS and end the SNP's addiction to wasting your money, restore our public services, and only Scottish Labour can beat the SNP across Scotland. The road to a new direction for Scotland in 2026, with Anna Sarwar as First Minister and a Scottish Labour government, begins right here. So let's go and win it together. Thank you.
So that was the new MSP for Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse, Davy Russell. Look at the beaming smile on Anna Sarwar's face. We're going to hopefully grab him for a chat before we go off air tonight. Let me speak first, though, here to Paul O'Kane. You have a new parliamentary colleague. Congratulations. You must be delighted. Anna Sarwar's delighted. Davy Russell's delighted. What just happened?
Absolutely. That's an outstanding result, and I think testament to the campaign that we ran, testament to Davy Russell and his presence in the community. But I think fundamentally, and Davy mentioned this in his speech, it clearly puts to bed the notion that Labour are anything other than on the pitch for 2026, that Anna Sarwar is ready to deliver a new direction for Scotland as First Minister, and that is the fight we will now take to the country and the vision that we will offer to the people of Scotland. But it is a remarkable result, Martin.
Have you achieved this despite Sir Keir Starmer and your colleagues at Westminster?
I think we have very clearly put forward a positive vision, not only in terms of the Scottish parliamentary issues that were raised, but also about the work that a UK Labour government is doing. And yes, we need to do more, further and faster, and you've heard that, I think, across the campaign and indeed tonight. But it's clear that we have a plan for our economy across the whole of the UK to put money back in working people's pockets. But here in Scotland, we want to have a plan, and we've got a plan to address NHS issues that we hear about, the housing emergency, and to change the life of Scots for the better.
I'm not sure if you answered the question. Maybe it was in there somewhere. Have you done this despite UK Labour? Because they haven't done you any favours at all in the last year, really, up here, have they?
Well, I would disagree in terms of the advancements we've seen in increasing the national minimum wage for workers, ensuring that £5 billion of funding, a record settlement.
Taking away all sorts of benefits.
Hold on, Martin. A record settlement for the Scottish Government since the history of devolution to spend on schools and hospitals, setting up GB Energy and moving forward with our agenda to secure the economy. I think that has been delivered. But I think clearly in Scotland, we have an opportunity now to go to the people and to show them our vision of what Scotland can look like to end 18 years of the SNP's incompetence.
All right, listen, we've got the result now in full, I think, verified and graphicised. Let me just see if we can bring it up Onto the screen, there we have it. Right, there are the votes cast. Labour's Davy Russell is the new MSP for Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse. 8,559 votes cast for him. The SNP's Katie Loudon in second place. 7,957 votes for her. Ross Lambie of Reform came third. 7,088 votes for Reform UK. The Conservatives' Richard Nelson, 1,621 votes. Anne McGuinness of the Green Party next, 695. And Aisha Mir of the Lib Dems got 533 votes. Turnout there, 44%. Here is the vote share. Labour with 31.6% of the vote. The SNP with 29.4%. Reform, 26.1%. Scottish Conservatives down on 6%. The Greens on 2.6%. And the Lib Dems on 2%. Right, let's just have a look at how that has changed since 2021. Labour down 2, SNP down 16.8. Reform, unsurprisingly, given the 5-year gap, 26.1% up. The Conservatives, 11.5% down. The Greens up 2.6%, and the Lib Dems down just under 1%. Right, so there you have it. Results confirmed. Angus Robertson, let me just ask you the same questions I asked Paul O'Kane. You'll give me a very different answer, I'm sure. What just happened?
Well, the Labour candidate won the by-election, so I think it behoves me as a... Well, no, first of all, I think for our political culture, I think it's important... I think it's important for people of different political traditions to congratulate political opponents. We're rivals. And our parties have stood. All of our campaign teams have worked extraordinarily hard. I know my candidate, Katie Loudon, would have been a fantastic MSP. My heart goes out to her tonight. It wasn't her night. And the Labour candidate has won. So that's the most important thing that needs to be said at the start of this. It's an extraordinarily close election result. The support for the Labour Party is down. Support for the Conservative Party is down, and the support for the SNP in the by-election is down. That raises questions for all of us.
It's not all that close.
And the Labour,
602
majority is not a huge majority, but there's no
touching 10%.
There's no getting around the fact that the SNP didn't win tonight. We didn't win last year in the constituency when the Labour Party had about 50% of the vote. That doesn't make me feel any better, because I would have wished the SNP to win tonight. It wasn't to be, and obviously we're going to have to look very closely at all of the permutations, what happened in different parts of the seat, what happened in terms of relative turnout for support between the different political parties, and learn the lessons, because in next year we have a Scottish Parliament election campaign where it will be either a First Minister, John Swinney, or a First Minister, Anna Sarwar, from a political party that promised change last year at the UK level and didn't deliver, so why on earth should anybody believe that they would deliver change in Scotland?
Well, I mean, are you worried looking ahead 11 months, given what's happened tonight?
I think it is good to be in a competitive contest in an election campaign. I've always believed that to be the case.
You'd rather be miles ahead. That's nonsense.
No votes should... No, it doesn't matter how far you are ahead. There should be no complacency. And for a political party that has won every single national elections for the Scottish Parliament for the last 18 years, we take that very seriously. So we'll be taking nothing for granted. And I really hope that Katie stands again. And I think she'll make an excellent MSP in the Scottish Parliament. Next year.
Are you worried?
No.
Right. OK, there's the answer. Thank you very much. Succinct. Helen McDade, David Russell's speech there, the poison of reform isn't us. It isn't Scotland. We don't want your divisions here.
OK, well, we've heard a lot about that tonight. I think the votes speak for themselves. We're the winners tonight. We've come from nowhere, and people have said, thank God there's somebody else to vote for. And next year, they know we're real people to vote for. They know. I mean, you were talking about the Collington by-election for the council was mentioned by Craig. We got 26.5% in Clydebank last week. You know, it is across the board. People are looking at what we're saying. They don't just listen to the mainstream media and they think, well, you know what, there's something wrong. There's something wrong when I can't afford to feed my family, when 2% extra has gone on my national insurance and I'm an employer and I'm going to have to lay people off. People are really fed up. And if they didn't pick that up on the doorsteps, they weren't listening.
So where do you go? How do you build on this to just give it that push you need to really succeed, to win constituencies next year?
We're building up an infrastructure from nowhere, that was mentioned before. Of course, all the other parties, they knew where their good votes were. Every time there's an election, we collect it, so we didn't do so well in Hamilton. We were picking up, obviously, in Larkhall, but also Stonehouse. So we're learning, we're going to be out there canvassing. We'll know where to go. We've got a year to prepare for it. And, I mean, also, I agree with Leslie about proportional representation, about several things she said, but on this one, it's important. Next year, it's proportional representation. Give us a fair shot.
Right, listen, I'm going to come to you quickly, Craig Hoy. I'm hearing we've got Richard Tice lined up. We might be speaking to him in a minute. But what does this result tell you tonight?
Well, I think it was a disappointing result at the outset. I said I think we were going to have a challenging result. We didn't lose our deposit. Maybe I was overly pessimistic earlier. But I think what it does go to show is we've got a job of work to do to restore trust with the Scottish people. That's what Russell Finlay and my colleagues are determined to do. We've got 11 months now to do that. We're up for that fight. We're up for that challenge. And that's why if we develop a common sense policy agenda, we will be able to set out a whole series of concrete policies that will address the problems that the SNP haven't addressed over the last 18 years and that Labour and government at Westminster have clearly not managed to deliver upon.
Forgive the blunt question, but what are you for now?
Well, it's quite clear that we will set out a very, very clear stall. For example, on the union. We don't know where reform stands on the union. It was quite clear when Nigel Farage said he'd be, quote, quite happy to have another SNP government, that there's something going on between these two parties. And actually, John Swinney talking up reform meant that they actually almost won a seat, that Labour in the equivalent Westminster seat got 50% in last time. So there is still that threat that if you vote for reform, you'll put John Swinney in Butte House next year.
OK, let's talk to reform. I think we can go now live to the hall in Hamilton. There he is, the Deputy Leader of Reform and the MP for Boston and Skegness, Richard Tice. Good evening, Mr Tice.
Good evening, good morning. What a remarkable three-way marginal result we've just heard here. Quite historic, actually.
So you're seeing it as a success, are you? Because people were suggesting you might well come second, maybe even push the leading party.
Well, look, I mean, it's so close, it's too close to call, but we're delighted with a remarkable result, just a few hundred votes away from the SNP. Credit where credit's due, Labour have won tonight, and one should recognise that, but no one was predicting that we would do as well as this to create a three-way marginal situation in Scottish politics, a year, just short of a year ahead of the Holyrood elections. And look, we're thrilled to bits. As our brilliant candidate, Ross Lammy, ran an outstanding campaign with his brilliant team. Massive thanks to them. Of course, we've all got work to do, but this is a massive boost for us. And what it really shows, doesn't it, which is a good thing for democracy, every single vote counts. It is vital to vote. Good turnout for a by-election, 44%. But we're thrilled to bits, absolutely delighted.
Your party's been accused from several corners of injecting poison into Scottish politics. How do you respond to that?
I think people just don't want a disruptor sort of interfering with the cosy establishment that's built up between the Labour and SNP. Obviously, the Tories have disappeared down a plug hole. They may have saved their deposit. But look, what we've injected is common sense discussions about important things, about net stupid zero, about the brilliance of the oil and gas industry, that we should be maximising, not shutting it down, and talking about important things like that creates wealth and prosperity. And I think more debate, more discussion is good. People want to throw accusations and labels and smears. I think maybe they're just terrified of our progress. They cannot understand that maybe they've actually got things wrong. They haven't been properly representing the great Scottish people, and here we are. This is a remarkable result. Absolutely delighted.
Yeah, it's been quite the day for you. What happened to your party chairman? Zia Youssef left the party today saying effectively he was wasting his time with you.
Look, I'm very sad that Zia has resigned as chairman. He's done a brilliant job in the last 11 months. He's worked his socks off. We're very grateful. A lot of our success in the May elections and indeed the build-up for this, is thanks to him. And I just want to put on record Nigel and my sincere thanks to him. And look, politics is difficult. It's hard. It's brutal, and it's just difficult sometimes. And sometimes it's not for everybody forever. It's It's a pretty demanding process, I can assure you.
Why did he leave?
Look, a good question. I've not yet spoken to him. I've obviously messaged him with a sadness and huge thanks. And look, sometimes things happen, but what is clear is that thanks to his efforts and Nigel and the team, we have seen huge momentum, hundreds of branches being created, and here we are in a Scottish by-election, MSP by-election. It's a three-way marginal, too close to call. Okay. No one knew right up until the declaration who had won.
Yeah, you've said that. I want to come back to Zia Youssef because it speaks to a bigger issue within your party, does it not? He had said that a comment that one of your parliamentary colleagues made yesterday at Prime Minister's questions about banning the burqa was dumb because it wasn't party policy. Is that the reason he left? And do you think that burqas should be banned?
Look, I don't know why Zia has chosen to leave. What I do know is that it's right to have a debate and a discussion about this sort of issue. Most people in the country wouldn't be aware that about 7 European countries have already banned the burqa. Let's have a debate. Let's find out where the British mood and thoughts is on this. And you can discuss things without it. You have to have a policy on absolutely everything. But what you should be able to do in a democracy, in a world of free speech, is have a sensible, respectful debate. And that's all that Sarah Pocham quite brilliantly yesterday in PMQs asked for. And I think that's
what's your position
perfectly reasonable.
Do you think the burqa should be banned, Mr. Tice?
Look, my position is that in a country founded in Christianity, where everybody is equal, I'm very concerned that the burqa can be perceived as repressive for women, making women second-class citizens, which obviously we live in a world of equality, quite rightly. And so, yeah, there are real question marks, but let's have a discussion about it.
Is that a yes? Do you think it sounds like you're edging close to calling for a ban on
these things are very personal views. I want to have an open, respectful debate on it and find out where the British people are, and I think that's a good thing.
Why are we talking about burqas all of a sudden? I haven't heard the burqa debate for years.
Because you asked me.
No, but why did your parliamentary colleague bring it up? I'm asking you because your parliamentary colleague asked the Prime Minister out of the blue.
Because she is a woman who's concerned about issues of national security, concerned about equality of women, concerned about what she's been hearing from her constituents, who she brilliantly represents. And look, it's perfectly reasonable to ask, sensible questions that we should be able to discuss. And what I really, really think is wrong is when people in the media and the establishment say, no, you can't talk about this. It's all too naughty. You're terrible people. Absolutely not. We're a democracy. We live in a world of free speech. Let's talk about things in a calm, respectful way, rather than saying, you mustn't talk about this. Naughty, naughty you.
Let me ask you one more question, though. We're trying to piece together the mystery of Zia Youssef's resignation. If he was irritated by that question, which he described as dumb, do you think he may also have been irritated by your party's ad campaign during this election campaign, decrying Anas Sarwar and suggesting he would favour the Pakistani community?
No, not at all. Absolutely not at all.
OK, well, that's a straight answer. Richard Tice, we will speak again, I'm sure. 11 months out from a Scottish election.
Thank you very much
indeed. Thank you very much
Have
indeed
a good morning.
for your time. Thank you. Right, I am going to cross the studio now and get the sage to crunch the numbers. John Curtis.
Well, we said at the beginning of the night that if this result were to follow the evidence of the most recent Scotland-wide opinion polls, we would get a very close result between Labour and the SNP, and we got a very close result between Labour and the SNP. There is nothing in this result to disturb what the broad picture that we have been anticipating, given these polls. Labour's vote, yes, we should congratulate Labour. They have won, and all due credit for that. But actually, their share of the vote is slightly down on what it was in 2021. So this is evidence that confirms the evidence of the opinion poll that the revival of the Labour Party that took place in the 2 years running up to the general election has indeed disappeared, that the party is indeed more or less back to where it was in 2021. But at the same time, as you and I were discussing not long before the declaration, with the SNP vote down by 17 points, here is more than ample evidence that indeed the SNP, while it might have steadied the ship psychologically, has still made very little progress in advancing on where it was at last summer. It's just that its vote went down a bit more than we might expect from the national polls, and therefore Labour win. I suspect some people in the nationalist movement might well spot that the Greens, with 2.6% of the vote, if they hadn't intervened and if those voters had voted for the SNP, the result would have been different. The one thing that is a bit of a surprise, given the national polls, is frankly the support for reform. That 26% almost matches their best performance in the Scottish local government by-election during the course of the year, which was the result in Clydebank. It is higher than we would expect given the current polls in Scotland. It certainly is very bad news for the Conservative Party, who are frankly being had for breakfast, lunch and dinner by reform at the moment, so far as the public is concerned. They're at 18% in the GB-wide polls. They're down to 12% in the Scotland polls. The Conservative Party cannot afford for reform to gain momentum north of the border, but equally more broadly, frankly, also now, both the SNP and the Labour Party need to think about how are they going to effectively deal with reform. For all the complaints about Nigel Farage's ad, it is not clear from this result that it did any damage. And I think I would point out to both the SNP and the Labour Party that what they ended up doing in this by-election campaign was giving an awful lot of publicity to a message that they thought was not a very good idea. And one of the first rules in politics is to avoid scratching the itch of things you do not like, because you simply end up potentially giving them the airtime. And the truth is that evidently Mr Farage's message was not sufficiently unacceptable for at least a body of people in Hamilton for reform to record a quite notable share of the vote, and certainly the highest share of the vote won in a parliamentary contest by any anti-EU party in Scotland.
I'm being very thick, I'm sure, but just explain to me clearly, where did these 7,088 reform votes come from? They can't all have come from the Tories. Labour won.
Oh, sure. Well, no, look, I mean, it depends on what you take as the baseline. And the evidence we've got for the most part is from last summer. Compared with last summer, according to the Scotland-wide polls, and given this result, there isn't much reason to disagree with it, around 1 in 4 of the people who voted Conservative last year, diminished in number as they were, in Scotland are switching to reform. But Labour also are losing somewhere between 1 in 6 and 1 in 5 of their voters to reform, of the ones they had last year. OK, now I think one of the reasons for that, why Labour are losing votes to reform as compared with last year, is that in the general election last year, Labour were more successful in Scotland than they were in England in picking up the votes of people who had voted Conservative in 2019. But that does therefore mean that probably the voters that Labour had in Scotland last summer were always more susceptible to going to reform than was the case south of the border. Labour south of the border are losing about 10% of their vote to reform. So as compared with last year, the picture in the polls is quite clear. If we go back earlier than that, the point is that Labour still have a chunk of those pro-yes supporters who voted for the SNP in 2021, but who have not returned to the SNP fold. And this election confirms very, very clearly that the SNP still have an awful lot of work to do to get those voters back on side. And it does illustrate that, indeed, although, given if this kind of result were to be reflected across the whole of Scotland, we'd still bet about the SNP being the largest party. They are still on relatively fragile ground.
Right. John, I can listen to you all night, but I'm not allowed to. We have Scottish Labour leader Anas Sarwar, I think, on the end of the line in Hamilton. Good evening, Mr Sarwar. Congratulations.
Good evening, Martin. Thank you so much, Martin.
Are you surprised?
Look, I'm not going to say we definitely knew we were going to win, but we always believed that we could win, and it was a straight contest between ourselves and the SNP ultimately on who would win. But I think it's important to reflect on what I think the people of Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse have told us, and that's partly reflecting on the result, but also on the many, many conversations I had on the doorstep. And I think it's 2 or 3 main things. Firstly, I think people have made it clear that they do want a UK Labour government to move much more quickly in demonstrating an improvement in their lives. Secondly, I think they are sick of this SNP government that they feel has done so much damage to the country after 18 years, and they do want a change here in Scotland. And third, they have ultimately rejected the politics of Nigel Farage and of reform. And I think what the people of Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse have done today is lay the first path in a road to electing a Scottish Labour government next year. But of course, we've got lots more work to do.
How much more work do you have to do, and what kind of momentum do you think this gives you? I mean, are you optimistic now looking ahead 11 months?
Look, absolutely we're optimistic, but we've got to do hard work, humility and energy and demonstrate the positive difference we would make if we elect a Scottish Labour government. But I think it's important to note that we have, in this by-election, proven the pollsters wrong, the political commentators wrong and the bookies wrong. And I think this has been one of those elections where the disconnect from the national mood music and what was actually happening on the ground was so stark.
Right.
And that's a credit to our campaign team, it's a credit to our candidate, it's a credit to our message on the ground. But we need to do more of that over the next 11 months.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a reasonable suggestion that you've done this despite what's been happening in Westminster. There's been a fairly kind of broad consensus that your party down there haven't helped you in the past year up here. Do you expect to win the election next year?
Yes, that is our expectation, that is my ambition. I believe that we can win that election, and my ambition is to be First Minister next year, but ultimately that's only going to happen if we persuade people across the country to support us. And I think what they've shown today is that they're done with the SNP, they're scunnered with the SNP, they want the SNP out of office, but we still have work to do to prove to them that we can make a positive difference if we elect the Scottish Labour government next year. But what's also clear from today is that Reform aren't at the races. They can't be the government next year. All they can do is help keep the SNP in office. So if you want to get rid of the SNP, if you want to change a government, the only party that ultimately can do that is the Scottish Labour Party.
Right. Reform would argue they've done pretty well tonight and are at the races, but that's for another day. Listen, we're going to leave it there. It's been a long night for everybody. And Sarwar, congratulations once again. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Look, just before we go, let me come back to my other two panellists for a quick final thought. Leslie Riddoch, what are you thinking?
Well, I'm surprised. There's three things going in my head. Health was an issue we never talked about here particularly. A neonatal unit was being closed. And generally speaking, people's worry about health is a really big issue that we probably haven't spoken about. Local, I mean, Davy Russell was the local candidate, and it's very possible, and I will include myself, that perhaps we were sort of sneering, actually, about someone who, for people there, they just wanted to know that he was one of their guys. And that really counted more than any of us factored in. But the other thing is vision. And if the SNP can't put a vision forward of a different kind of country, it will be problematic. And of course, this is where I keep coming back to this. We've got to figure out a way to push an idea of independence that is the solution to many of the problems which are being given different answers by the other parties.
Yeah, be an interesting manifesto from the SNP next year to see how they navigate that. Lucy, just a final thought from you?
Yeah, I think that, as John said earlier, it was always going to be close between Labour and the SNP. I think what I find really interesting is the margins between Reform and the other two parties. I think they've got a number of challenges, though, going ahead. Nigel Farage wants to be Prime Minister by 2029, but next year he has to show that he can do well both in Scotland and Wales, and the party does not have a proper infrastructure. Zia Youssef, its chairman, has left today. It doesn't really have that many policies, and when it does have policies, it's pretty incoherent on them. And third of all is delivery. I think if it cannot prove that its councillors and potential MSPs next year can deliver, then it's going to have a big problem ahead of 2029.
And Zia Youssef was the man who was effectively recruited to make sure that whole machinery was kind of oiled and running properly, right?
Absolutely. I mean, he really professionalised the party. And I think, as you heard what Richard Tice said tonight, yeah, he's definitely to credit for the success that the party saw in the local elections. I think it's a real loss for Reform, and I think they are feeling that shock tonight as well.
All right, listen, we're going to leave it there. Lucy, Leslie, John, thank you very much indeed. Helen, Paul, Craig, Angus, thank you all too. Look, we said at the very start of this that if Labour won this by-election, we would have a story. Well, a story is what we have. Davy Russell, despite many people's predictions, is the new MP for Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse. MSP, rather. You got that ahead of me, didn't you? We will see him in Holyrood, I'm sure, very soon. We'll see you all very soon. But for now, that's it from us. Thanks for being with us. Good night.